Hello and welcome everyone to our Clinical Express webinars. These are really short, about 30 minutes long. And today we'll be discussing the basic criterion templates. Let's go to the next one. So I'm Nick Schreiber, I'm your host today. I'm one of the ABA subject matter experts here at CR. And what I will show you next is the rest in the series. So today we'll be talking about the basic criterion templates. So building out within session prompt fading within the CR system. The next Clinical Express webinar, we'll be talking about forward and backward chains and different modifications you can do to those. The third webinar in the series is advanced criterion templates, so building out systematic prompt fading. And then our fourth and final webinar in this series is discussing goal auto progression and using templates to do things like changing criterion designs. So I will scroll over to this page. And the first thing that I wanted to start with today was to show you guys some materials that we have available to you. So right now, this is the Central Reach Clinical Manual. This includes all of the functionality of the clinical module. We have a syllabus right here. So in clinical templates, everything you could possibly want to know about instructional notes. Same thing with criterion, library templates. It's a really, really good resource that if you want to take yourself to the next level, or if you're bringing on anyone else in the organization who needs to get up to speed on CR, you can give them the link to this. So where you actually find this is inside of the marketplace. So the way that you can get there is from the clinical module, marketplace, go to marketplace, but I'm just going to send you the link right now in the chat. So I've got the Central Reach Clinical Manual, and if you go to your chat bar, you'll be able to download it from here. Okay, so I've sent that off, and now we can get right into the content for today. So I'm going to get rid of those. So the first thing first, we're going to be discussing a lot here in the settings and criterion and prompting. Now, some of you may have access to this, others may not. If you're ever interested in building out criterion templates, you can always talk to your administrator and see if you can get access to this. Typically, these templates are built within goal banks, and you'll be able to do those. So to kind of show you how to get access to this individual section, which is right here, the permission that you actually need is living inside of Learn. So I'm going to go into my admin permissions. So if you want access to those criterion templates, it's within the Learn options. And it is the Settings, Criteria, and Prompting Templates Manage. And what that's going to do for you is give you access to these right here. So this dropdown. So now we can finally get into the really fun stuff, building out our master templates, which of course will save you lots of time in the long run. So navigating to our criterion and prompting templates, the first thing you'll see is all of these listed here as system. So these are master templates that we've provided for you. Now, what most organizations who are recently onboarded with CR, what they'll do is say, okay, this is pretty close to what I'm looking for. We actually have copy buttons right here, which allows you to make mirror images of these exact templates after you explore them and kind of make the modifications as you see fit. But what we'll do today is walk through the workflow of how to actually build these from the ground up. Now, what today's webinar is about is these within session prompt fading ones, whereas the third webinar is about systematic prompt fading. So two different workflows, but today we're predominantly going to be focusing on the within session prompt fading. So I'm going to clear that one out. I'm going to show you the back end of what this looks like. So selecting the within session prompt fading. What we can see here is we have the hierarchical criterion. So moving from baseline to intervention to generalization to maintenance. Now, you're probably asking why does maintenance look like this and why does hierarchical look like that? And all that this hierarchical really means is that these goals are on the data sheet every single day, as opposed to this non-hierarchical maintenance criterion, meaning that they skip from one data sheet to the next. So if I have a learner that's very, very successful in generalization, I may want to say, let's test this skill 5 sessions from now. If they're successful later, let's test it 10 sessions from now. So we're going to end up building the logic statements for all of these. But before we get into building all of these logic statements, I want to show you guys the end game. So what this is actually going to do for you. So what we had released a number of months ago was what we called dual criterion. And what that effectively means is you can have competing logic statements that say, if this, do that, but if this instead, do that instead. And where that is most applicable is for things like baseline and also regression criterion. So in baseline, you're testing a skill, it can go one of two places. You can either master the skill out at the onset, or you could say, you know what, they're not successful in baseline, we need to intervene. So I'm going to show you all of these on our next screen, and then we'll come back and we'll start building the template. So over to my next screen, I have a sample program book. Now, if you've downloaded the clinical manual, you actually have access to this identical program book and it can actually give you some inspiration on how to build programming. So what it's actually going to look like for you if you download that template is exactly like this. All the instructional notes are set up, all of it has criterion, all of the behavior reduction goals have a BIP. So it's just something that's very useful. And the way that this program book was built was just saying, go to library, pull up our CentralReach manual, down here in goal template samples, and just pulling in the entire ABA client book. So again, if you want to see the advancement, the same thing that you're seeing right now, you can actually practice with this because we've provided you this sample program book embedded within the manual. So I'm here in my sample session and I'm hitting start. So now we have to talk a little bit about workflow. This tacting of actions goal right here, running, this one is set up with our within session prompt fading template. And one of the logic statements that I had on here was, if I have 3 consecutive errors, intervene. And what that can actually be used for is if you're doing multiple probes within a single day. So at the very beginning of my session, I'm like, what are they doing? Learner is incorrect. They're not running. They were doing something else. I asked them again an hour later. They were unsuccessful. I asked them an hour later. So we had 3 distinct probes, all within that same data point. When I score that, you'll see that we automatically moved to intervention. So that's an example of the advancement to intervention from baseline. If 3 errors, go to the next, which was the same thing that we had right here. If 3 consecutive errors, progress to intervention. Now, the flip side of that, maybe you're taking more than 3 trials and you want to have 3 distinct data points with several trials. I can say learner's unsuccessful, graph that. There's my first data point. And look, it automatically moved to intervention. So in this particular template, we had 2 separate ways to move to intervention. The first one being a certain number of errors in a row to advance. And the second way being a data point with an unlimited amount of trials, however many you want. If it's less than that terminal criterion, move to intervention automatically. So what we saw met right here was the same thing right here. If less than 80% over 1 data point, move to intervention. Now, the last thing that we have to see before we move into the building of the templates is this one. If they meet mastery at the very onset in baseline, auto progress to maintenance, which is the same criterion that's down here. So I'll find one that's still in baseline. We did our 3 probes throughout the session that by the time I graph it, we'll see a notification at the bottom of your screen. 1 or more branches have been removed to the session due to maintenance criterion. So this is our non-hierarchical maintenance now. That 5 distinct start and stops must go by of the data sheet. So, therapist A, therapist B, therapist A, therapist B, back to therapist A, goal will come back. So distinct start and stops, but of course, don't forget to graph. So I will open this up. So what we're effectively going to build is this one. And then after this, if anybody has any questions, since this is an express webinar and we've only got about 15 minutes left in it, I'll hang around for the remaining 15 after that to answer any questions you have about the clinical module at all. So super simple workflow, could just hit the copy button, make your modifications, or we can build this from the ground up. So I'm here again in my settings and criterion and prompting. I'm gonna hit the add new button. And we can name this template whatever we want. So I'm just gonna say 80% physical template. I'm gonna hit save. And it looks a little bit different than the one that you had seen before. But all that we're doing right here is first we're deciding what are the buckets of the logic statements. So the buckets meaning kind of where all those logic statements start. So all we really need to do is say, I need a baseline. You know, we want to start out a few hierarchical to do the same thing because the maintenance comes later. So we want baseline. There aren't any prompts associated with that. So all I have to hit is add criterion. So we've got our first baseline bucket. But now I need to address my intervention. So type intervention, add my bucket. You know, very, very simple, just adding buckets. I also want to do generalization. So add generalization, add criterion, I have my next bucket. So the last thing I want to do is I'm going to say I want my non-hierarchical maintenance. So I'm going to say maintenance, and just to be consistent with other template, we're going to say how many sessions, so how many data sheets we want goals skipped when they're successful at this tier. So I'm just going to keep it really standard at 5. This can always be modified to fit your needs. So I hit add criterion, and now we get to do the really fun stuff. We need to start putting in our logic statements. So we're going to say, what does the learner need to get to leave baseline? So I'm going to open up baseline, and you'll see this little button right here. It's a plus button. We get to start building our first logic statement. So I'll go through all of these first, and then we'll start putting this together. So the calculation type, this is saying what the data points are over. So do you need something greater than, a data point less than or equal, greater than or equal to, kind of any of those. But let's start out with the mastery criterion baseline. That's probably the easiest way. So we say if data point greater than or equal to any value, and as you start changing these, it actually gives you the logic statement up here. So we're talking about mastery here. So if I'm saying, if I've got an 80% mastery criterion, I could say if greater than or equal to 80, but now we need to decide across what. So in some cases, you'll want your goal mastered across several days or several data points. But in our system, the language is a little bit different than the colloquial mastery over or baseline probes over data points. So our trials may be colloquially considered the data point. So if we said that we wanted, 3 data points, that's actually 3 distinct times a therapist is taking data, as opposed to this, which could have 3 trials within the individual data point. So in this particular scenario, you still get your 3 tests of the skill, but it's only living within the 1 data point. So it's the difference between saying that, minus, that's a trial, but you could say, call that a data point and hit graph, or you could say multiple trials. So kind of just deciding how do you want the goal to master out in baseline. And in a lot of cases, this is what we see, single data point, several trials that you tell your therapist to take, and then your criterion value. Now, what you decide next is, if this criterion is met, where do you want it to go? And in this particular scenario, because this is mastery, we want to tell the goal to go right into maintenance. So this is kind of the direction you say the goal should go. So I'm going to send that to maintenance. And in a lot of cases, we want a phase change line dropped right in there. It's like, hey, they got it in baseline, let's move right to maintenance and then drop in that phase change line. This hold goal is used more so in the intervention phase, where you've got a learner that's unsuccessful for a little while, you want to put it on hold and then come back to it later. So typically we don't see this in the baseline. What this required two providers will do is adds one more level of constraint to advancement, meaning that if you check this box, you must have at least two people taking data to be able to progress to maintenance. And what the last section will do is this is what turns the icon green. So mark goal is mastered, that's going to be reflected in your cumulative graphs. And in this case, because this is mastery and baseline, that's exactly what we want. So I'm going to hit save, and we have our very, very first logic statement here. But that's only really addressing the mastery. We need the failure criterion too. We need to tell the system, how do you get to intervention? So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to open it up and hit the plus button. And I'm going to give you guys the same behavior you saw in this sample program book. You can make any changes to this as well. This is just a sample to play around with. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to make the reverse of this. So if less than 80% over my one data point, I want to move to intervention. The same thing, I want to drop in my phase change line. So not only do I have, oops, I got to change that to intervention. Cool, so we'll see our logic statements match right there. So now we have our mastery and our progressed intervention. But I want to add one more level there because there are some cases I want to intervene within the same session. Because this is just going to change whenever you hit the graph button. But in some cases, we may want to specify that if my learner is unsuccessful 3 trials in a row, which is what we saw there, it gives therapist A the ability to intervene in a skill right away before waiting for the next therapist to come in. So that's where the advancement across data points comes into play. So I hit the plus button again. And in this time, in my frame type, I'm going to change it to consecutive error responses. So by me saying consecutive error responses, and then in a moment, we'll go over the rest of these when we get to the intervention phase. But by me choosing consecutive error responses, I'm pretty much saying if the learner gets it wrong, those several periods of time, then we want to intervene anyway. You'll notice that both of these gray out because you don't necessarily need them. In the sample that we had, we just had it as 3. So we're saying in baseline, if a learner has 3 consecutive errors within that data point, we want to auto go to intervention. So we'll see the logic statement right there. And then also drop in our phase change line. So I hit save. And now we actually have our baseline completely done. Now, baseline is one of the harder ones to conceptualize, just because it's saying you really need to think about failure criterion. But if this doesn't make all that much sense right here, it'll make much more sense once we go to the intervention, because now we're talking about mastery. So when you decide what kind of mastery criterion you're using, I'm gonna hit this plus button, and all that we really need is an advancement criterion at this point, or maybe a hold criterion if you really want that, because we're not going to regress back to baseline. There's only one place to really go, and that's right to generalization, unless you're not doing a generalization phase, in which case you would move right to maintenance. So now we get to talk about our mastery criterion. So in a lot of cases, what we see is something like a greater than or equal to 80%, you could do equal or greater than 90 or equal to 100, really whatever you want to set up. But where these frame types become very applicable is talking about these options right here. Consecutive calendar days is most likely one that you'll never use, because this means that 80% criterion must be met on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Or in some cases, if you take data on Friday and Monday and Tuesday, it's actually not going to count because it's considering Saturday and Sunday as well. So what we see most often is this next one down, because this is highly, highly restrictive, to super, super liberal as we kind of go down. So what consecutive days with data collected will do is, as long as you're taking data on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, as long as the learner is successful, we will advance. Now, consecutive data points is a little less conservative. And what that means is, if your therapists actually get a little bit click happy and hit 100% master, 100% master, 100% master, they could theoretically advance something within a single day. And in a lot of cases, that's not what we'll want to do. So if you want to kind of set it up with mastery across days, this is the one you'll use. Now, the average of consecutive data points is going to work very, very similarly to the consecutive data points. It's just that if you had an 80, a 70, and 100, that's still considered the average of 80, as opposed to 80, 80, 80, which is distinct data points at that exact value. So in this scenario, we'll set it up in consecutive days with data collected, and then we need to say how many days. To stay with that one, we're going to set it up as 3, and then we need to say, where is this going? So moving to generalization, drop in our phase change line, and this varies from organization to organization, but in most cases we see the goal mastered here, where it specifies that a goal has been successful with our prompts, which we'll do in a moment, and that we're ready to move to the generalization phase. So we have our intervention criterion, but what makes this intervention is, the therapist actually training this skill. So what we want to do is we want to add in all of our buttons here. So the same thing that you'll see, for this tactic actions goal, percent correct, we've got the options to code the entire hierarchy, or something like percent independent, where we're putting just regular buttons where they're choosing one option. So depending on what your template is, you may want to consider what those buttons are. So because this is my physical template, I'm going to put in my physical prompts. So I'll select my intervention box, my bucket, and then I start putting in my prompting strategies. Now, in most cases, I'll recommend setting this up as most to least, just because it works in tandem very, very, very well with our instructional note templates, where you can tell the learner or the therapist go from right to left or left to right. If you're using a template that looks like this, these were just check boxes, so allows much easier customization, but it's totally up to you. But again, in most cases, we see it set up as most to least. And then we've got a lot of different options here. But if you don't see what you're looking for, you can always type it in. So I'm going to type in full physical, partial physical. And then I'm going to put in the gestural and modeling just for good measure. So just by nature of me putting in those, I've got all of the buttons that are here, except in this case, we'll have modeling there. So going back here, we've got our intervention criterion all completed. Generalization is where things get a little bit different, where we're still going to want the same mastery criterion, to move from generalization to maintenance, but we'll also want regression criterion. Because if we get to that intervention phase and the learner is not successful, we may want to intervene again so we can tell the system, skip back here instead of moving forward. So something else fancy that you could do, I just add this bucket here for a space holder, but something that we're going to end up doing here, and then for the maintenance, just going to hit the trash can, is inside of this intervention criterion, we actually have the copy button. So if I hit copy, let's see here. Where did that go? Did I do the wrong one? Curious. Cool. Let's see here. What do I want to do? Just going to get my generalization criterion back. Cool. And then we're going to start building out the same one. So what I'm going to end up doing is emulating that same thing that we saw here, but then we'll put in 2 tiers of regression criterion. So greater than or equal to, 80% across consecutive days, 3 of them, and then I want it to progress to maintenance. Now, because we're in the generalization phase, you can do one of two things. You can either go to maintenance or next in the hierarchy, but it's going to end up doing the same thing for this particular phase. If you're going to do tiered maintenance, you'd most likely say next item in hierarchy. Or if you're doing regression with multiple intervention phases, you may want to consider previous item in hierarchy. So I'm going to set it up as next, drop in our phase change line, and hit save. So there's my first logic statement for generalization. So this is the advancement. Now we want to put in some regression. So we need to tell the system, if they get the reverse of this, we want to intervene again. So I'm going to hit my plus button. In this case, we'll do less than 80. So if less than 80 over the same exact frame value we've got, we want it to regress to either intervention or the previous item in hierarchy. For this scenario, it's going to do the same thing. So I'm just going to say intervention, just for clarity in those. And then we'll drop in our phase change line. And now we have an advancement and regression. Now, in the template that I showed you in the very beginning, we had if 3 consecutive errors in a row in generalization move back to intervention. It's something that's optional, not necessarily needed, but something cool that you could add. Won't necessarily put it in here, just in the interest of time, to give you guys time for some other questions. So now we're ready to start talking a little bit about maintenance. So with the maintenance, we're saying that this goal is tested every 5th session. So if they master something on session 1, it's going to be gone for session 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. It's going to come back on the 7th, or maybe math's wrong on that one. It's going to come back on the 6th. So 5 distinct sessions will go by, and that will be here. So with the maintenance criterion, we actually want to set this up with data points instead of days, because it becomes exponentially more difficult to advance if you set it up across days. So if I say across one data point, if the learner gets 100%, so if they get it right within that one data point on that 6th session, then we can advance and we can test it again. Now, you could always have this be a little more forgiving. You could say something like, if my learner gets better than or equal to 80, you could run 4 trials of that and still have it calculate over 80 and be like, you know what, I didn't have sufficient stimulus control within that first trial, throw that trial out altogether. This would be a little more forgiving to address that. So by me saying, if greater than or equal to 80 over one data point in that 6th session, advance to the next. So what we would end up doing there is we could add in one more level of maintenance. So this one's available every 5. We could have the next available every 10, the next available every 15. But we won't necessarily hit that copy button until we do our regression criterion, because we need to establish what's going to happen if my learner is not successful here. So typically it's the reverse of this one. So if less than 80 over my one data point, I want it to automatically regress back to intervention. So instead of moving back to generalization, we may want to re-intervene again, which would take it all the way back here. So we auto add in phase change lines, and we are all good to go with our maintenance criterion right here. So I'm just going to minimize this. And now we've almost got this template done, and then I'll open it up for some questions. So here in the baseline, I want to duplicate this again. I think I'm having a little difficulty with that one. Let's see. There we go. So now we've got that working. So great thing about this copy button is once you make all your logic statements, you can just hit the duplicate button and you're all good. I'll do the same thing. And in this case, I want to tier it. So I want to say, if they're successful here, make it available in 10. Or one level further. If they're successful here, make it available at 15. So what this is going to do for you is this is going to give you a within session prompt fading template. So effectively, it's going to give you, moving to baseline to intervention, it's going to give you all of those buttons. So just to reiterate, this same template that we just built already lives in all of your accounts if you have access to that Learn Templates Manage or the Criterion Templates Manage. You could easily just hit this copy button. Now, the workflow that we just showed you as well is still applicable in the master learning trees as well if you do not have access to these templates. So what you have the ability to do right now, so any of you that have access to the library templates, is you can actually build out your criterion from there, and you can always use the bulk copy on that one. So you'd still be able to do all of that. So I'm gonna hop open to my goal bank and just show you how you can use these, and then we're good to go. And I will open it up to questions. So this is an example of a goal bank skeleton and the way to actually use those templates. And if you think of any more templates that you'd like, you can always talk to your administrator and have them provide them for you. So applicable on the target level. So we're here on the target level. What you can do to use those templates is hit import template and use the one right here. And that is how you use the criterion templates. So that is all that I have for today on this one. If you have any other clinical advanced features you'd like added to your account, you can always book a call with Greg Paquette, and I will hang around for the next 15 minutes or so and answer any questions you've got with the entire clinical module. And to everyone else, thank you for attending, and I hope you have a great day.